So welcome everybody, good afternoon. I am really excited to introduce the Digital Transformation Office, that is Kylie Doherty and Alistair Parkinson, right? Parker, sorry. So as you know, we have been quoting a lot of the DTO standards in a lot of the talks we have given and strategies we have developed. Because what's happening right now is that the air is full of good ideas at the moment in technology and science, and it's almost like all these good ideas are starting to condense like little droplets, and they're sort of condensing on the window. All these droplets are coming together because they're made of the same material and becoming puddles of water, larger droplets, and they are sort of rolling down and into small streams and into rivers, raging rivers, and into the ocean, right, of one big, good, consistent idea of where we're going. And they are all things around innovation. They are things around agility. They are about collaboration, adaptivity, all those sort of things we're talking about. And instead of hearing it from me, because I'm sure you're really bored with that by now, I'll let DTO give the presentation. Over to you guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ole. So my name's Kylie Doherty. I'm the Standard Education Manager at DTO. So recently I've been working on iterating the standard. We've recently gone to a live version of the standard. It's gone from 14 criteria to 13, and also getting out and starting to train people and train assessors and that kind of thing. This is Alistair Parker. I'll just let him introduce himself quickly.
I'm, I guess, what the DTO calls a technical architect. I provide, I guess, loosely speaking, consulting services around the technical aspects of the DTO, the technical aspects of the DSS, and broadly provide technical advice and assistance to teams that we have coming through the DTO and teams who are doing DTO-type activities. So I guess there's a bit of good synergy here to come along and talk to you about technology approaches, and doing technology in an agile and meaningful way.
Great, thanks Alistair. So we'll just start, I'll take you through some of the general background of the standard, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty I know you want to talk about, such as open source and common platforms, or a couple of the criteria that I know that you're interested in. So how do I go to the next one here? So the scope of the standard, just briefly, it's on our website. I won't go into it in great detail, but from the 6th of May, when we went live with the standard, so we'd been out there, we'd tested it, run some projects within the DTO, and some external agencies had applied it, made these iterations I spoke of, and went live. Any public-facing, non-corporate government entity needs to apply the standard. So if you're project of developing a new service or redeveloping a service starts after that date, you must apply it. And if it's a high volume transactional service, I'm not sure geoscience has any of those, your assessment is DTO led. If it's any other type of service, you'll need to run a self-assessment. So we'll get into that a little bit later. We're running some training sessions which we call First Fridays, which you're all welcome to come along to. There's also a lot of other government departments and governments around the world that are starting to move to this digital transformation methodology and agile methodology. So our standard's based on the UK government digital service standard. We recently found out that the Scottish government is adopting a hybrid of theirs and ours, leaning towards ours, they said, so that's exciting. The South Australian state government is adopting the standard. They're rolling that out now. And Canada, USA has a 18F project that's really interesting if you're you want to read some more of the details that they have. And so it's, and private sector is also adopting Agile, so it's just the way a lot of people are moving. So we don't have time to go through all the 13 criteria. I'll just take you through some of the themes, and as I said before, we'll dip into a couple of the key ones. So one of the themes you can think about with the criteria, which I've printed out here for me to refer to, but you can print it out from our website as well, I just didn't know how many people would be here to print out a whole bunch of paper. So it's really all about user needs and users first. So criteria 1 is understand user needs, research to develop a deep knowledge of the users and their context for using the service. So there's no point building anything really if people can't use it. So this whole methodology just brings the service design back to looking at the users, seeing what they need, and then seeing if it works for them and iterating it to make it better for them. So we have lots of user stories and all sorts of techniques and artifacts that you can use to understand user needs and also tell that story to the rest of your team or to the organisation you're working with.
Just on that, one of the things that's very, very big to us organisationally and part of our mantra of success is that we're very, very big on having teams, every member of the team, building up experience and understanding and sympathy with the users. If they've got a problem, we want people in the team understanding what their problem is so you can have empathy and help them solve it in a better way. And so we get people from many, many disciplines, many, many walks of life who are all part of the team on board on day one, talking to people, understanding what the problem is. It doesn't really matter if you're a user researcher or you're a programmer or you're a service designer. We want everyone to understand what the pain your users are going through. So when you go back and do your own work in the discipline areas, you can find the best way that you can to get rid of those pain points for their users. So we're really, really big on having people understand the difficulties that, sadly, our services are imposing on the community and our users. So that's a big driver for us.
Yeah, and we talk about developing that empathy, and when you build a service team, you want everyone in that team, from the developer to the business analyst, to get involved in user research and actually get out there and perform some user research. So that's something that we encourage. So this is just an image, you can't really see it, but what it is are different prototypes that this project team have developed and the user needs that each of those prototypes meet. So that's just one visual way you can start to really understand how what you're building directly links, what you're building links to the users. And if you come to the DTO, you'll see there's post-it notes everywhere. We're probably keeping the post-it note industry alive at the moment. Lots of texters, all the walls you can write on. So it's a really good environment to work in this way. And we would encourage anyone who's adopting the standard to try and find a space. We know it's not as easy out there in agency land and in departments, but it is important to have that visual trigger every day that you're looking at. Again, another visual trigger, these dashboards are quite common. Each week they would get updated with how many people you've spoken to, and again it's just a thing that keeps you mentally connected to your end user, which is really the whole point of what you're developing the service for. So the second theme, design. We go to the Agile and user-centered process, which was one thing we wanted to talk about today. And so this is your more traditional waterfall process, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. You start out defining your requirements for your project straight up, procure it, find out how much it costs, develop it, and then you launch it to the user. And so often you'll find that you've made some false assumptions, that perhaps it wasn't required in exactly the way that you thought it would be, or it doesn't integrate with some other important systems that are out there. So that's how using Agile methodologies can help address that.
It can also be quite disempowering for people in development land. If you're at the end of a long process and people in an ivory tower have said, you're going to build this, you're going to build it this way, and you've got a good idea about how things can be done better or more meaningfully, you don't really have a chance to say that or raise it. And we know that people have really, really good ideas because they're the people who build the systems and run the systems. So without giving them an opportunity to raise their hand and say, look, I've got an idea about this, we're really trotting on these people, unfortunately. We've got really, really good ideas and really, really good investments. Equally with the users, they're even further down the disempowerment line. They're stuck with whatever gets built. So the further you go to the right down this, the less empowered that you become. We really want to bring everyone back up to the left and say, you can all participate in how this works. Everyone's got a view. Everyone knows the way this could work. Let's put everyone's ideas down on paper and do the best we can as a group, rather than the people in the ivory tower come along and saying, do this, build it this way, come back to me when it's done and built. It also doesn't work, right? As soon as you have a defect or a bug or an issue in the design, there are enormous amounts of documented evidence-based cases out there that say the cost of fixing problems gets significantly higher the earlier that problem came into the design and development process. So by getting people who use the system, who build the system, who know the system involved all the way up front, you can reduce a lot of those really, really expensive issues earlier on in the process, which is good from a cost-saving perspective.
Yeah, so this is more of the Agile perspective, where there is some fear that you're sort of spending all these resources in user research before you get to the nitty-gritty of actually building what you want to build. But as Alistair just said, that often will save you money in the long run anyway. So discovery is a phase where you're doing user research. It doesn't need to be expensive. You should be able to run that with your BAU funding. You just need one user researcher and maybe an IT person to help you start to do that user research. And then as you go into alpha, you start to explore potential solutions. You've got to be really careful not to get into the solution too quickly. Keep your mind open. Create one or more prototypes and start testing that with end users. So being agile is all about fast development cycles where you build enough to be able to get it out there and then get that feedback from the users as quickly as you can so that you can continue developing in the right direction and improving.
Just talking about technology quickly here. In Discovery, there's not really a lot of technology in terms of what you build. There's still expertise around analysing the systems, the dependencies, the impacts on making these changes, looking at what the inputs and the outputs are of systems. In Alpha is when you actually start building something, but we, in the DTO, highly recommend you build it in the cheapest, dirtiest, throwaway possible. And so you do that using boring technologies. So most of the work that we do at the DTO at the moment is around websites, because that happens to be where most government services are. So when we're doing Alpha technology building, we highly recommend people do really, really simple HTML, CSS and JavaScript. We put those on top of a really, really simple static site generator called Jekyll, which runs on top of GitHub, so we can quite quickly have, for free, examples of prototypes out there to the user community in 30 minutes, and you can change it in another 30 minutes with almost no investment and no cost whatsoever. As you progress into beta, that's when you start doing things that are a bit more serious in relation to your target technology, but you can really shred a lot of those costs by getting lots of your designs right in cheap technologies first, rather than getting your designs wrong in really expensive technologies. So investing when you need to and being agile when you want to is really a big part of this process. So spend less early on and save more in the long term.
Yeah, so it might be at the end of alpha or beginning of beta that you do your business case and you go, this is what we're going to build, this is where, we need a chunk of money. So this is the DTO's service design and delivery process based on what we just spoke about. We have these assessment points. The alpha assessment point is at the end of alpha before you go to beta. The beta assessment point is at the end of private beta before you go into public beta, and then you have one before you go into live. And we've just introduced an in-flight model, which means that the people who are assessing your service, the experts that you have on a panel who are helping you throughout the process, are actually with you week to week. So it reduces that gateway, which was presenting itself to be a bit of an issue in a number of ways. This team had to get a panel of people up to speed on their project, just before they go into beta in 3 or 4 hours. They were finding out about problems too late. So we're finding this weekly support is better for the assessors and for the team. But again, I won't go into that too much today. We do have a training session on the standard and the assessment process, and when you're looking at actually developing a service to the standard, that's when we can talk about that in a little bit more depth. So yeah, we talked about the prototypes and the MVP, the minimum viable product. You'll start to be defining that in beta. And so this is a little visual description of how you can look at an MVP. You're not building bits and pieces of a product until you get to a final working product. You're building something that works quite early on in the stage, and that enables you to get out to the user and see how it works for the user, and it gives you value for your product quite early on, so you can show something, and then you iterate and improve in this incremental way.
It also means, from a project management perspective, I guess, if funding got pulled to your product halfway through, you're not stuck with 2 wheels and no body. You're stuck with maybe a bike when they wanted a car, but they can still use it to get around. So by rapidly delivering the value that you've produced to your users in a way that they can use, it doesn't really matter how far you get through the process, they can use it. Maybe not to the fullest extent of their intent, but they can at least do something with it an awful lot more than you can at either steps 1, 2 or 3 if you're doing a big traditional incremental build-based approach. So by releasing value as you do it, as quickly as you do it, is a very big driver for us. Just anecdotally on this for a second, the big people, the big players in the private industry world are releasing new versions of their software to their customers on average 6 times a day. So people like Amazon are doing an update every 15 to 16 seconds somewhere across their business line of a small incremental usable piece of work. And that allows them to get enormous feedback on the direction that they're taking, the decisions that they've made, and working out, is it working for the users or is it not working for their users? So it's a really, really big valuable technique of making sure you're building the right thing the right way early on rather than too late.
Yeah, and in that discovery to live process at the DTO, we try and time box that in a 20-week process. So, 20 weeks is not very long to build something hugely complex, but once you get to that live point, you continue iterating and building on your MVP from there. But as you implement the standard, 20 weeks may not be suitable for you, but we do try and advise people to keep it short, because otherwise then you don't get bogged down in the wrong path. And so this is just, if you have lots of complex systems, it's really daunting. You're like, well, I can't solve this in 20 weeks. How am I going to apply Agile processes and the digital standard to fixing these problems? And so this was an example that came from the UK. I won't go into it, but I think this just highlights the concept of identifying pain points. So you do your user research and you find out in this whole environment where the biggest pain points are, and then you choose one that you can solve using the digital design process, and then you can work on others and link them up and slowly, gradually fix this big mess of a system that you have. So it doesn't mean it can't be applied to big complex problems. It just means you need to focus in on a pain point and solve issues one by one, really. You can't solve them all at once anyway. So we'll go on to criteria 2, which is establish a multidisciplinary team to design, build, operate and iterate the service, led by an experienced product manager with decision-making responsibility. So on the left there's just a screen grab of our website where we have the standards, and if you click through to each of those succinct standard headings, you come to a page that gives you a lot more information about how you're going to be assessed against that criteria, what you need to do at alpha, what you need to do at beta, and so we're working on providing more and more of that support information as we do more user research and see it get implemented.
The biggest part of that statement for me is the last part, with decision-making authority, and that's particularly relevant in IT teams. Traditional IT responsibilities are fragmented across the organisation. You've got business analysis up front, you've got people who iterate your service and operate your service on one end, you've got people who do change and release and deployment. We want all the people who've got responsibility for making changes to the product that you expose to users being in the one room at the one time so they can make the best decisions for themselves. You don't want to be beholden to some external process or group or body to say, well, if you come to us yesterday, you could have got it tomorrow, but because you came to us today, you have to wait 18 months to get there. That's death of what we're trying to do. So we really want these teams to be the owners of this product. You want the people to be responsible for this product, how it works, what it does. They're the people who build empathy for the users. They're the ones who know what needs to be solved. We want them to be responsible for saying, we know that people are having difficulty with tax, for argument's sake. We can release something to them after tax time. That's not going to help them very much. Why don't we release something to them before tax time instead? If you stick with traditional waterfall-based processes, the team typically hasn't got the flexibility or the control to make those decisions. So we really want to centralise those decision-making points to the people who know the product and the users best.
Yeah, and we would definitely recommend that when you're putting your service team together, that person that you call the product manager, it used to be service manager, but we were finding in departments anyway, service managers were so high up, they weren't involved in the project on a day-to-day basis, and they weren't able to make these weekly decisions. So we have changed it to product manager, but whatever you call it, the person needs to have the authority to make decisions, otherwise the whole thing falls to pieces. And having this team together is also about how you work, having, ceremonies such as stand-up meetings, sprints, retrospectives, all of which you can find a bit more information on our website about. You'll find in the design guides area there's a document called The Team where you can have a look at all these different roles, user researcher, developer, accessibility expert, and put together what you need for your project. You won't need all of those roles in every project, but you really need a good spread, and user researcher and technical and product manager are really the key ones. And we've also got a handbook there, which you'll find on the page where you have that alpha, beta, live diagram, and we have an alpha handbook and a beta handbook. We're working on releasing some more, and that will tell you a little bit how to set up the team as well. So user-centered design, it's all about user-centered design. You can have the best sauce in the world, although I don't think I would call Rosella tomato sauce the best sauce in the world. But if you can't get it out of the bottle, if the user's having trouble accessing it, it's not a good design. So it's not just about the product, it's about the experience. And so you've got to look at that full user journey.
Yeah, that's particularly important for government where people don't have choice. They're stuck with the government. If we implement a service that is mandatory and critical, they can't find another one. There's no choice available to them. So it's a bit airy-fairy, but we are responsible for how people interact with us. And if we only offer them bad services, they'll have bad experiences. They can't go and find another one. So we've got a captive marketplace, and we owe them a little bit to make sure that we give them something that is worth their time and worth their money and worth their effort, and they can use first time and succeed first time rather than having to ask for help and assistance as they go through. So it's a bit menial, but it is serious. Bad designs can lead to bad outcomes. Typically they do.
Yeah. Okay. So this is about developing prototypes that you can share really quickly. We often suggest that products are built mobile first, and then you expand that out to the desktop because that's where a lot of the users are now, and it's easier to go in that direction. But basically you want to get a prototype out there that people can use really quickly.
Just on that, mobile is also very important as well because of the constrained screen size. You're forced to put the important things first. You're forced to shred things that aren't crucial to this particular experience of the user. So by having constraints, you have to make tough decisions. And when you make tough decisions, you're forced to put yourself in the mindset of someone who's using this. Do they want feature A or do they want feature B? Do they want it on one page or two pages? So by really looking at very, very small scale environments, which as we said, is where the majority of people access government services now anyway, the ancillary benefit is you're forced to really think of what's the most minimum viable thing people want and need at this particular point in time. You don't throw a whole bunch of superfluous information at them if they don't need it now. Maybe put that somewhere later on. Focus on giving them only what they need, only what they need, and only what they need, and only what they need. That's all. Also, people in Australia have different levels of literacy. So you want to make it as simple and as clear and as easy to understand as possible for people who have potentially reading difficulties or learning difficulties or understanding difficulties. So by focusing on small and direct and to the point, you typically get better quality outcomes rather than big. So get smaller screens rather than bigger screens. Okay, so we'll leap to criterion 7.
build using open standards and common government platforms where appropriate. So you don't need to build everything from scratch, you don't need to develop it. It's faster for you if there's something else out there that you can use, and it's more economical and efficient for the government. And at this point, I'll hand you over to Alistair.
Sure. So this stuff gets pretty dry with me just here yelling things at you, so by all means, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, please throw them at me and I'll do my best to answer them. But as Kylie said, use open standards and common platforms. And she's right, you can't be expected to build everything from scratch on your own. In fact, you don't, right? You don't write your own compilers, you don't write your own web servers, you don't write your own operating system. So why would you expect that everything beyond that point you have to do for yourself? It's nonsense. So where possible, look for things that you can steal for the most part. There is a huge amount of open source stuff out there that's fantastic. There's a huge amount of stuff out there that the Australian government has already written that's fantastic. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that your own department has already written that's fantastic. We highly recommend and stress that wherever possible, during the discovery phase, do appropriate research and look around and see what's out there. It may not be perfect, but it's probably an awful lot better than building it again from scratch. So where possible, use other things. The important word there, though, is open. Yes, you can go and buy the latest Microsoft, the latest IBM, but you're then stuck with that forever. It's now proprietary. If you want to move away, if you want to evolve, you've now got enormous costs associated to you. Not at all saying IBM and Microsoft don't have good products, but they restrict your ability to move forward in the future. If you can pick an open standard or an open platform that allows you to be not locked into a particular vendor, it allows you not to use proprietary interfaces, it also means that whatever you produce can probably be used and built upon by the community without having to pay for proprietary interfaces and proprietary services. So as governments, we want to make the work that we do impact the most amount of people in the biggest way we possibly can. And so if there is a paywall in front of anything we produce, we're doing a disservice to the community. So by using things that are open and available and free, it's making it a lot easier for people to pick things up and use and run with. Now, on one hand, what that means is, which ties into the next criteria about making things open source, but on one hand, if you make things open, people outside your team can improve upon them and you benefit from that. Equally, if there are things that you use that underpin your solution, you can improve those and the people who build those get the benefit of that as well. Whilst those people potentially are nameless faces people somewhere around the world, if those people are people in your department or people in the Australian government building services, we now get a very, very good combined effect where we're all investing in something once and benefiting from multiple times. So it's difficult to stress enough that this is a very, very important thing to do. The other side of this criteria is using existing common government platforms. Now, admittedly, there aren't a lot of them out there that you can use. There are some things that have been built that people want to make available, but they typically haven't been made available because people don't know how. There's no common registry. There's no common place where you can describe in a meaningful way how people can use the components that you've built. If you broaden your definition a little bit from common government platforms from just IT systems, for argument's sake, I know for a fact that, without knowing the specific names, if you want to send SMSs in the Australian government nowadays, the Australian government has negotiated on behalf of the Australian government a better price point with SMS providers. And so if you sign up to this policy or platform, as it were, you can get the benefits of the investment the government has already made in that space. I was talking to someone on one of our transformation projects at the moment, and he's even going further and saying, we've got a bunch of providers who provide us the best price SMS, but it varies from day to day to hour to hour. He's planning on building a service that sits on top of that and says, if you want to send an SMS today or tomorrow, I can pick for you the cheapest provider of that service, of that SMS, and make it available to everyone else. So when things are open, people can put value on top of them, and you can all use it for the betterment of everyone going forward. So we, the DTO, have some work to do in that space around making it easier to collate and describe and make available to people a list of common government platforms and services, but it doesn't necessarily stop you from doing your own research and looking now or making your services available to other people. Certainly for geoscience, I would imagine you've got a whole bunch of data available to you, right? That's a fairly obvious one. You can make that data available to any number of people in many numerous and interesting ways, and by doing that, as I'm sure you already do, people can build interesting things on top of value. We'll jump across to the next one, which is sort of the flip side for this one. Make source code open. So if no one builds common platforms, there are no common platforms to use. So it's a bit of a chicken before the egg. The DTO is at the moment going through a process of building some common platforms. They're not ready yet, but they will be, and when they're available, you can use them. But until we get to that point, we're stressing and hoping that people who have built something they think can be useful in the wider community will think about making it open to people. Source code is part of this equation, but it's not the entirety of this equation. My personal belief is that There are some products where the source code is more valuable than the output of that service, and in which case the source code is exactly what you want to make available to people so they can get it for themselves. There are other circumstances, though, where the output of the product is more meaningful than the source code, things like services, things like data. So don't just read source code here. I think read make things open, and whatever way makes the best sense for what you've built, you should make that open in the best way that makes value to other people. So if you have a service that provides mapping data, for argument's sake, you should make that available. Probably also make the source code for that available as well, but people are probably not going to want to run their own service if you've got one available to them in the first place. So look at this with a little bit of openness around how you interpret it. Both are needed, unfortunately, but there are different strategies depending on what you build and how it works and how it operates. A lot of government departments and a lot of people get worried and scared by open source. There are a lot of ways that you can do it right, but there are a lot of ways you can do it wrong as well. The DTO is in the process of putting some guidance together around when you should, when you shouldn't, how you can and how you can't go along and doing it. But there are some fairly high-level objectives which I don't think are too disruptive to talk about. Fundamentally, if what you're building is so trivially small and there is absolutely no case for anyone using it outside of it, maybe don't worry about making it open. If it's a Hello World or something like that, it's probably not worth your time or effort in doing that. But really anything above that might have value to someone else. We don't want to stop people putting things out there because you don't think it'll be useful to someone else. That being said, it comes with some caveats. If you just dump your entire big blob of stuff out there, it's unlikely someone's going to go to the effort of pulling it apart and finding the gold inside there. So if you have built something that you think might be valuable, it helps you, it helps your consumers if you pull them apart maybe a little bit and turn them into individual products that people can use individually rather than as a composite. You'll typically find that way that people will spend more effort looking at what you've produced rather than trying to pull apart what you've produced to get to the value. So if possible, try and build it that way. It's also good architectural practice, right, to decompose and make things separate. So if you're doing that anyway, just go a little bit step further and say, well, rather than having these things as multiple projects within the one overall solution, maybe make them individual products in their own right, put them online, put a description of how to use it, put a description of how to compile it, put some commentary up around. If you have any comments or concerns, please let us know. If nothing happens, but at least you've done your part in putting things out there and making them available to people. The flip side of that is, if you just put stuff out there and don't describe it to anyone, even if you've decomposed it into smaller chunks anyway, but you don't tell people how to run it, how to build it, how to maintain it, no one's going to look at it anyway. So by doing a little bit of extra work on top of it to make it accessible to people, you'll probably get much better outcome from it in the first place. The other side of this is there are issues with making things open source if you haven't thought about it in advance. So the last thing that the DTO wants is for you to leak your secrets online. So if you start putting passwords or your credentials or your keys inside source code, you typically have to do a lot of work first before you can make that open. The DTO has some suggestions, as does Google, have plenty of suggestions on what things you can do if you accidentally leak out your password into your GitHub. There are things you can get back, but it's typically better if you instigate practices in your organization to stop those things happening in the first place so you don't have to scramble to try and get rid of them. But just because it is a piece of security code doesn't mean you can't necessarily make it online. If you take the secrets out of it, it typically still works. If you think about Linux, for argument's sake, the entire kernel of Linux is open source, including the way it does SSL, including the way it does password-based encryption. The algorithms and the code that implement those security features is not where the value in the security is. It's the secrets that go into that process that make them secret. So in and of themselves, telling people how you do security doesn't necessarily make it less secure. That being said, though, you do need to always do due diligence and make sure that you do critically analyze the risks associated with doing this. So don't just make things open because it feels good. Make sure you're doing the right thing for your products and your users first. The DTO has an ethical hacker on hand, and the intention behind him is that he can provide help and assistance and guidance to people going through the DTO process for doing these type of things. Whether or not you want to hire your own or maybe send us an email with some questions, I'm sure he's more than happy to give you some informal advice and say, gut feel is this, maybe you don't want to do that, maybe this you do want to do. But on the whole, you can make a lot of things open. But again, I would put the proviso around that. If you're going to make it open, do a little bit more to make it accessible to people and truly open source, not just happens to be open and available to people. Otherwise, it's highly unlikely that people will pick up and run with it. Any questions on open sourcing or common governance standards or platforms at that point? Yes, back first. Sorry, mate, then we'll come to you.
I noticed a lot of focus on users. I think you're talking about public users. Developers here, obviously, we've got developers are users.
Yep.
Some of the open standards that are advertised on, I think you listed Oasis as one of them. There's a lot of sort of open standards. Although they're open, they're a horrible developer experience. So what do you do weighing those up?
So I'll just reiterate that for the record, I guess. Your question fundamentally was, your statement was that there are more users than user and facing users, including developers. I'd also expand a little bit and say, including people who actually use your system internally, administrators, data entry. So yes, you're absolutely right. There is a broad category of users, and we definitely count those all as users. And your follow-up was the developer experience as a user can be quite bad based on some external standards, some external processes. So yes, you're right. The DTO, certainly, given that we come from a very developer-centric base perspective, understands these things, and we certainly have opinions on that type of stuff. While they're not rules at all, we say things like we prefer things like REST over SOAP, for argument's sake. We prefer things like JSON over XML. So whilst we can't necessarily mandate those things across government because A, it'd be too difficult, and B, it's a bit nonsensical to put those hard rules in place anyway, we do definitely have these perceptions, these understandings, and when teams make decisions around how these things work, if there is a component of your system that is heavily impacted by those things, let's say you're building a wholesale service that other people come along and build often to the community, definitely ease of access, ease of use, ease of implementation is certainly a key part of that. But it's on a project by project, on a user by user needs basis. So some projects don't have developers as users, other projects do have developers as users. Some projects do have data entry as users, some projects don't. So I guess the short answer to your question is absolutely yes, but it depends on the specific use cases of those projects. But absolutely, you'll find that there is a synergistic, almost parasitic relationship between providers and consumers of services. If it's great for one but bad for the other, it will die. It needs to be good for both, otherwise it's not going to flourish. So absolutely right, we need it to be good for everyone who's using it, including the government. Otherwise they won't invest and won't pay for it. Next question.
So you talked about, I guess, releasing code as open source at the right time.
Yep.
We've been recently spruiking here that the earlier you do it,
Yep.
the easier it is to
Absolutely.
So we've been literally today just doing the final tweaks on a code base we've got called Amazon, which just creates cloud infrastructure in short. But there's been work associated with doing that realistically, if we open sourced before we even had any code,
Yep.
when we just had an intention, they certainly wouldn't have been jobs that we needed to do in their own right. They would have naturally happened.
Absolutely.
We've been naturally thinking
Yeah.
about that. So if we are going down the line, and some of the other principles you've talked about are about taking the approach of if it's useful,
Yep.
make it available.
Yep.
In the same sense, shouldn't we make our code available to other people as early as possible and let them make the decision as to whether it's of value to them or not?
Absolutely. So I'll just reiterate again for the microphone. So I guess fundamentally you're saying that you're going through making code open at the moment, and you're identifying that activities are easier to do on your code base if you had the intention of making it open earlier on, and you're suggesting that a criteria for making things open is also the timeliness, I guess, of the earliness of doing this sort of work. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we at the DTO, if you throw your mind back to what I said earlier about doing very, very low fidelity, cheap technology for prototypes, we say make those open, right? It's highly unlikely anyone's going to want to pick them up and use them, but it gets the team into the ethos of saying we need to put this out there. We need to do the right work now and put it out there. We need to do the right work and making sure we don't divulge secrets. In fact, one of the criteria is about security, privacy, and that sort of stuff. And so teams are forced to think about that very early on. So yes, you're absolutely right. The earlier you can make things available, if they are going to be available online and open, the better it gets. You put the right practices in place, you put the right team dynamics in place, and it sounds trivial, but if you know someone's looking at what you're doing, you typically force to do a better job. In fact, there's a phrase, a common phrase online along the lines of program like the person maintaining your code is a homicidal maniac who knows where you live, right? And so if you think about that up front, you tend to be less lazy, right? Yes, I could call this variable I, but I probably should call it something meaningful that conveys to the reader what's actually happening, so I'll do a little bit extra work there. And yes, you're right, there are a lot of anecdotal ancillary benefits from being open, and the earlier you can put that philosophy into your team, into your project, into your products, they just naturally become better. In fact, one of our catchphrases, our slogans is make things open, it makes them better, right? And even if you don't necessarily make it open as in open source, by thinking that way, the quality of what produces is better because you are worried that someone is looking at you and judging you, right? And so, yeah, absolutely right. That's a very, very big driver for us. And as you say, we make GitHub repositories because we use GitHub. As soon as someone says, I've got this idea, fantastic, make a GitHub repository, put a README in there, put a license in there, maybe even just let that percolate for a day or two and let people in the organisation think about it, talk about it, people outside the organisation think about it, talk about it, and then start doing some work. So yeah, it's not quite the same as camping a domain, but it's similar to that. We want to carve this niche out for this product, and we want it to be open from the outset all the way through, even if no one's ever going to use it. Absolutely right.
So you talked about some platforms that you're going to make available to people.
Yes, so there was a blog post on the DTO quite recently issued about this, and you'll forgive me, I don't remember them all verbatim, and I highly recommend that you all sign up to the DTO blog. We don't spam you at all. I think we put out one blog. When we're not in caretaker period, we put out a blog a week. I don't think we blog at all for about 10 weeks now, but aside from that, we put things out. I think there was one about platforms roughly 5-ish or so weeks ago, and they are roughly around things like identity. Certainly one of the big ones we're doing at the moment is a trusted digital identity framework, making it easier to identify, I think, firstly individuals and then businesses and then probably even agents of individual business later on. There is one about GovAU, so a single point of information sources to the community and those type of ilk. So I highly recommend you go and have a look and read that blog post. But if you're interested in those platforms, you can do one of two things. You can either get in touch with the DTO and say, I'm interested, I'd like to know more, or because all the work we do in the DTO is in the open, you can simply follow and have a look. Have a look on the GitHub repository, see what they're doing, see where they're going, make comments, make suggestions. We're very, very big on getting feedback from people, both inside government and outside government, and even outside Australia. So we are absolutely interested in those sorts of things. That being said, though, I think the total set of platforms the DTO is thinking about authoring is less than viable. So if I had to take a stab in the dark about the number of platforms needed for something of this size and scale as the government, 50, 100, 150, so 5 is a start. They might be the core set of platforms, but there are an awful lot more out there that need to be built so we can all benefit from them as a result. And they don't have to come from us. They don't even have to come from the government. If someone else has built a platform like Amazon, right, we use that instead. So the important thing is they're available to people. The important thing is that they are open so people can use them, not necessarily free of charge, but free as in free speech, not free beer, and that they solve a particular purpose. So yeah, absolutely, platforms are a big driver at the moment for the DTO, and I highly recommend you participate where you can. Yes.
So you mentioned Amazon. What's your position on some of the Google tools that are available?
So we internally to the DTO use Google for fundamentally everything thereabouts. We use Google Documents for our document storage. We use Gmail for our mail, obviously. We use Google Hangouts when we want to do video conferencing. So Google is our standard operating environment for the most part. It's come as a bit of a challenge, I think, for some government organisations. We have a transformation program that we bring agencies through, and they do work with us, and we help enrich the way that they do their digital service delivery. Certainly, some of them have had difficulty with their internal security restrictions and permissions around not putting things on Google because it's not hosted in Australia, and Patriot Act and Privacy Act and all sorts of things. But for the most part, agencies have been fairly happy and okay with that. But it is up to individual agencies to make their own risk assessment and security assessment around what you can and what you can't do. But for the most part, I think it's a fantastic trial test of a cheaper and easier way of running a fairly small to medium-sized government department. Not all government departments are the size of you or the size of DHS, the size of ATO. They don't necessarily need their own SOE built on top of Lotus Notes or built on top of Microsoft. And so Google for us is working amazingly well. So from a personal perspective, I find it amazingly useful to be able to do work from my phone or from my laptop, sitting in a cafe, in an airport, wherever I happen to be. Arguably, I think by forcing you to put things electronically rather than just informal conversations, there is a record of what you've said. And so as you scale and as you grow more people into your team, it's much easier to say, have a look at the conversation we had a couple of days about this, come up to speed and look at it. So it's much more difficult to do that in an environment where you don't have that freedom and flexibility. So yes, we're very, very big on Google. We also use a lot of other sort of interesting technologies. The one we use of note is called Slack. It's an instant messenger. It's much more like IRC, a chat room, I guess, but it works very, very well for us. We've got chat rooms per teams, we've got chat rooms per topic, we've got chat rooms per discipline. Everyone can come along and participate and make comments and look at things. They work very, very well for us. Amazon as well. We use a couple of companies sitting on top of Amazon, but we still fundamentally use Amazon as well. And all of our transformation projects we expect to be hosted on top of that, and certainly all of our platforms we expect to be hosted on top of that as well. It's very cheap, it makes a lot of sense, and we don't have to spend a huge amount of money with infrastructure. We pay for services instead, so it works very, very well for us with those type of platforms.
And we've still got a secure network when you do need to deal with cabinet and sensitive documents, but for the most part, Gmail is great.
Yep, absolutely. Other questions?
Maybe next standard. Sorry.
One question here first, then we will move on. Yep.
Yeah. I'm not a developer or anything along those lines. I'm a data provider.
Yep.
But I'm just wondering, in terms of the concepts, that sort of thing that you've been talking about, whether you've got any experiences or stories around how those same concepts can be used in the data provision side of things.
Yep. So I'll just read that as well. So fundamentally the question is around how do you apply this sort of thinking, this sort of process to data provision rather than potentially code provision. I guess it depends on the particular use case and how you actually want to expose it to your consuming audience. If you are really just giving them raw data as large chunks, then that's probably different to exposing a service that people can come along and do analytics potentially on top of or querying on top of. So I guess the experience is the main driver there. To be honest with you, the DTO hasn't necessarily done any work in thinking about just big data dumps at the moment, because we're very, very big on fundamentally the end user or the developer of the previous question. Data dumps and the type of things we're doing at the moment haven't really come into play. So the answer is we haven't really done a lot of thinking about it at the moment. The flip side is if it was an open service where you're exposing the data through a service perhaps, then I don't see any reason why many, if not all of these things play an equal role on a web service as they would for a website, for argument's sake. So that being said, two of the projects that the transformation agenda is delivering for two government agencies have a web service component to it, and they are assessed against this criteria just as much as another team building a website. So things like test the service from end to end in an environment that replicates the live version is immaterial whether or not it's a website or a web service. Encourage users to choose the digital service and consolidate or phase out existing alternatives, equally valid. Understand the tools and systems required to build, host and operate, equally valid as well. So I think if it is a web service, I think it's synonymous with website for the most part. If it's a data dump, then I think it's probably a different question. I do know that it's an issue in other jurisdictions as well. So 18F, as Carly mentioned earlier on, one of their open source products is a tool that will take a data dump in any number of formats and make a web service out of it. You don't have to do any configuration or coding. You simply say, this is encoded in CSV or this is encoded in some form of water XML format. And as long as the thing knows how to interpret that format, it will add a web service on top of that you can now come along and query. So there may potentially be some options around how we, as a government, can standardise access to big blobs of data that aren't necessarily serviceable in their own right. But the short answer is the DTO hasn't come across that problem yet, and as such we don't really have any thinking in that space. But we're more than happy to talk to anyone and everyone if they've got suggestions or ideas about that as well. There's also one question at the back.
A little bit of a follow-on, but what do you define, you mentioned very early in the talk about transactional departments or processes. How do you define that?
So the question was, how do we define transactional services, I guess?
Particularly in the context of the requirements that the DTOs are after?
Sure. So let me quickly extrapolate and elaborate on that a little bit. So the DSS applies to all transactional services over some threshold by the
The standard applies to all public-facing services. If you're a high-volume transactional, you just need to be assessed by us rather than do your own. We're defining transactional as something that changes a government record, basically. Does that answer? Is that? Over 50,000 transactions per annum. Yep. So it's all on the website. I didn't want to get too down into the nitty-gritty of that. But yeah.
Anecdotally, we had someone from the UK's DTO equivalent come and speak to us in the DTO recently, and they said the government's definition of high volume is pretty poor compared to the private industry's definition of high volume. They worked out that comparative to all the electronic interactions that happen within the UK, government interactions is less than 0.00001% of those things, for argument's sake. And so high volume doesn't necessarily mean high by the community expectation. So it's I guess, without saying arbitrary, it is an arbitrary threshold point, but I guess in the context of what technology is available relatively free out there, it should be fairly simple to implement those things at a fairly reasonable cost and effort perspective, given what happens in the industry at bigger sizes and bigger scales.
Yep.
Sorry, go on. So just regarding the open services and sites, and interestingly, the identity platform that you're working on, very much interested in the identity integration of that. But what's the DTO's position on user registration generally for services?
To reiterate for the microphone, what's the position on registering users to get access to services? I think holistically we don't necessarily have one. I think if the particular service requires it, then it requires it. If it doesn't require it, we would prefer you to not bother users where possible. So speaking a bit out of turn, I know there are a bunch of government websites that force you to sign up and register for a GUID, an access token first. It doesn't restrict what you can get access to. I think they do more things like wear leveling and making sure that you don't abuse the services in some way. I think there are probably other creative ways of solving that problem rather than forcing people to register up front. And so I guess without the DTO having an official position on it, personally as a user and a provider of services, I would say if you don't have to do it, don't do it. Think of other creative, possibly policy drivers instead that allow you to not have to do that, because everyone has had to sign up for a service in the past. I personally, every time I have to sign up for a service I use once, I make a fake email address with a fake password and a fake name, because I genuinely don't value that service enough to come back to it again and again and again. That's not good for anyone, really, me or the service provider. So where possible, if you don't need to make something private or restricted to a group of users, don't do it. But that being said, it does happen. It is a real problem. It happens quite a lot. And certainly, as you say, the digital identity framework or the identity platform we're building will have to touch on that in some way, so we don't adversely bother people having to register again and again and again for multiple government services. The trusted identity framework is in, I think, alpha at this point, so they haven't necessarily answered all those questions. But by all means, if you've got some commentary and questions out, that I'm sure they'd love to hear from perspectives around government service providers around how it works. So short answer to your question is, DTO doesn't have one. If it's required, it's required. If it's not required, please don't do it. That being said, if anything is required, please don't do it to your users. In the context of minimum viable, making things simple and easy, give them everything they need but nothing they don't. So I think that goes along with that ethos of minimum viable products rather than potentially conflated big products if it does more than what they need. But fundamentally, no, I don't think the DTO has a position on that at all at this point.
So what if there's benefits to the users in registering? So a degree of personalisation,
Yep.
Providing a way to engage with those users so that you can update them with things about
Yep.
services and offerings like that.
So to reiterate, if there are genuine benefits to the user from that, then absolutely, that should come out naturally the process of discovery. That being said, there are other creative ways of targeting people and fundamentally remembering people rather than forcing them to register. So I guess at a theoretical level, yes, we want to remember people so we can give them tailored, targeted service and differentiated advice. But there are a bunch of different implementations that we can take which may vary between forcing people to register, maybe just remembering some details about them like their usage patterns or their profiles or their access points or any number of things based on how sensitive the information is, based on how there are a bunch of criteria. But absolutely, those things are a key driver behind delivering a better quality user experience, which comes out of the discovery and the service design delivery process. So conscious of the time, we might end questions there, I guess. Fundamentally, there wasn't a lot left in the presentation. There were a lot of other slides to go through, but I think these were the ones I think you were primarily interested in. Was there anything else burning that you desperately want us to cover in the last 5 or 6 minutes?
Well, I mean, what is your sense of uptake from the rest of the government? What you're doing?
That's an interesting question. So certainly the transformation teams who come through our process and physically co-locate with us and sit with us for 20 weeks, very good. In those organisations as well, we're finding that there is a bit of institutionalisation of these processes as these teams go back. They go back and say, this worked really well, we delivered this quickly, easily and cheaply, and the organisation then responds to that and says, well, let's do it again. The flip side of it is if people are only getting cold calls about the DTO, or if they're getting a bit of a negative reaction by people saying you must do this thing that these people over there told you to do, it doesn't have the same sort of in-depth inception, I guess, as it were, in the organisation. On the whole, though, I haven't come across anyone who has disagreed with these points. They may disagree with some of the particular tactics or mechanisms of implementing them, but the overall strategy of improving government, making it more cost effective, making it more open, making it more tailored to users, making people's problems go away easier, I think it's fairly universal, certainly for people in government. We want to do things, we want to make things better and easier for people. So at that level, it's almost impossible to disagree with these things. As I said, people will always have difficulties in agreeing to things like technology. Do you do it in Rails? Do you do it in Django? Do you do it in Microsoft WCF? They're not particularly material to a delivery of a good quality of service to the user. And almost the DTO says, we don't really care how. The important thing is you deliver something meaningful and good and cheap and effective. How that's up to you in the best way you possibly can. We have opinions, as everyone does, and we'll more than happily tell them to you, but for the most part, that's not necessarily as important as a good quality of service to the user. So we don't necessarily have a lot of pushback, I think, thus far on the DTO. Follow up?
You mentioned you have a hacker hired.
We do. Ethical hacker. His name's Graham.
Yes. So how much can we lean on you, or how much help could you actually give?
That's a much more difficult question. So I'll give you two answers. If you put your hand up and become one of the transformation projects who goes through us and sits for 20 weeks, I and the ethical hacker Graham will sit with you a day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, whatever is required to make it work for you. If you're not necessarily part of the program, we are limited. As an organisation, we have a staff of 100, 150 thereabouts, and we've also got things to deliver like identity framework, like platforms, like the transformation program. So we don't have a lot of free hours of consulting necessarily to come along and do. That being said, we're more than happy to respond to emails, but we may not be able to go any further than that.
So what does it take to be part of the program?
It's a very good question. We can put you in touch with the people who do that, but I don't actually know, but I do know that we're always interested in people becoming part of the program. Yes, I guess selfishly you get access to those things, but more altruistically, it's a great example for people to try new things, new ways of doing work, to sit with experts who know user research, who know product design, and learn new ways of doing it. So if you have a service that is potentially a candidate for the external DSS assessment, then I highly recommend you get in touch with us to put you in touch with the people who can evaluate you for being part of the transformation program.
Yeah, I mean, it has been the high volume transactional services that we're prioritising because you want to have as much impact as you can, but that doesn't mean to say you wouldn't be a candidate, because I don't think all of the exemplars are high volume transactional services, so just get in touch.
Yeah, so the list of ones we've done so far is on our website, but fundamentally they were one from DHS, one from ACT Health, ACT Government, one from Department of Immigration, in fact 2 from Department of Immigration and Border Protection. We started doing one for Queensland, but something happened there and I think there's a bit of a pause or a halt. But it doesn't have to be ATO, it doesn't have to be DHS. We're tackling everyone from any sort of scale and size. So by all means get in contact with us and we'll do what we can. Last question.
I've got one more. Amazon Web Services, obviously they provide some fantastic services, but there are questions being raised about how we can use them as government and whether we have service level agreements that are sufficient. What are your thoughts?
So it's a good question. All I can tell you is they are fit for the needs we've encountered thus far. So the teams that come to us, we look at them, we then negotiate with Amazon around where the data is held, and for reference there is a Sydney data hub for Amazon and all our information is held in there. That has consequences like what we can do around disaster recovery and replication. We can't obviously take that data and put it in Singapore or US for disaster recovery and backup, but we're able to navigate a path through Amazon service offering that has so far been amenable to the people who we've come across, that being the DTO, DHS, DABP and the ones I mentioned before. As new people come through the transformation program, we will have to evaluate their requirements against our offering and either reject, modify or think of something else to get there. But thus far, it has met all of our needs quite well, both from a product offering and a cost and a service and any number of things. It's been very, very good for us at this point in time.
All right. On that note, do you think you might arrange for the whole government an easier mechanism for us to use Amazon?
Yes, one of the platforms that I couldn't remember but have just remembered is something called cloud.gov.au, which is fundamentally exactly what you're suggesting. We want to offer a platform as a service that allows allows government, Commonwealth government entities to put their services on it with a minimal amount of cost, effort, money involved to get there. So yes, that is definitely one of the things that we're working on. Called the cloud.gov.au. I think it's tabled to be, the transformation projects we've got are running on there at the moment. I think it's tabled to be opened up to the wider public somewhere in the later end of the year sometime, but that's another one that we're working on at the moment, which information is available on our website.
Yep. And just as far as further help or communities or training, my links have gone blue, which isn't very helpful to you. But First Friday's training, we have an Eventbrite link. Email standard@digital.gov.au to get onto any of this. the communities of practice that we're developing. We so far have a service design community and a content design community. You can find links to that through the Our Work page on our website. Sign up to our blog, as we said before. There's an email list that you can join that we send out emails to occasionally to the digital community of practice. So again, standard@digital.gov.au. Email us if you want to be added to any of that. And also, if you wanted to think about the geoscience nominating a digital transformation coordinator, some of those bigger agencies have one, and we have events and meetings and emails targeted at them. So if you do want to do that, just send us a name and we can put you on the list.
Or we'll pick you.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it really. As for it being assessed against the standard, I'd encourage you to come to one of those training sessions. Yeah.
Otherwise, happy to answer any other questions you've got. We're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn, we have emails. You can get in contact with us if you want to, and we're more than happy to talk to you about whatever it is you want to talk about. We won't necessarily help, but we'll have to talk.
Let's thank the speakers. Thank you very much.